500 men didn't just appear in the wilderness. They didn't ride in formation behind a single commander unless something impossible had happened, unless a man who had nothing became everything. Nora Redstone stood at the edge of the mesa, watching dust rise on the horizon like a storm made of rage and purpose. The earth trembled beneath hooves she couldn't yet see. Her hands, calloused from years of survival, tightened around the worn leather strap of her water pouch. She knew that dust. She knew what it meant when the ground shook like that. An army was coming. But whose and why now, when her people had nothing left to take except their lives? 3 months ago, Nora's world had been whole. Her tribe lived in relative peace in the canyon territories, trading with distant settlements, raising children who laughed without fear. She had been promised to a warrior from a neighboring clan, a man respected by the council, strong in battle, secure in tradition. It was a good match, a safe match. Then the white settlers came with papers that meant nothing to her people, but everything to the men with guns. They wanted the land, they wanted the water, they wanted the canyon that had sheltered her ancestors for generations. When the tribe refused, the settlers brought violence. Fires consumed lodges. Hunters never returned from their paths. Children disappeared in the night. The neighboring clans, once allies, scattered like ash in the wind, too weakened by their own losses to help. Nora's promised husband died defending a water source 3 weeks ago. She had not cried. There was no time for tears when survival demanded every breath. Now she led the women and elders in the absence of warriors who had fallen. 17 families remained. 43 people, most of them too young or too old to fight. The Council of Elders looked to her for answers she didn't have. Food was scarce. Ammunition was gone. Hope was a luxury they had buried with the dead. And still the settlers circled like wolves, waiting for the final moment to strike. Nora had sent scouts in every direction, searching for allies, for mercy, for anything. They returned with nothing except rumors, whispers of an army moving through the territories. Not soldiers, not settlers, something else. A force led by a man whose name was spoken with equal parts fear and reverence. A man who commanded loyalty without heritage or title. A man who had built an empire from dust and desperation. She hadn't believed it. Rumors were cheap. Salvation was expensive. But now, staring at that rising dust, feeling the thunder of 500 horses shaking the ground beneath her feet, Nora felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in months. Not hope, something more dangerous. Possibility. The dust cloud grew closer. She could see shapes now. Riders in formation, moving with military precision. Banners she didn't recognize snapped in the wind. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Whoever led this force had power, real power, the kind that could crush what remained of her people without effort, or save them. She didn't know which terrified her more. A young scout, barely 16, sprinted up the path to where she stood. His eyes were wide, his breathing ragged. He spoke in their language, fast and urgent. The army was 2 hours away. They were heavily armed, well-supplied, organized. And at the front, riding a black horse that looked like it was carved from night itself, was their commander. The boy described him, tall, broad-shouldered, face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, clothes dark as the horse he rode. He carried himself like a man who had forgotten what fear felt like. The scout said something else, something that made Nora's blood turn to ice. The commander had asked for her by name. She descended from the mesa, her mind racing through possibilities, through threats, through every enemy her people had made. Who knew her name? Who would come with an army just to find her? The settlers didn't care about names. They cared about land. This was something else. Someone else. The remaining families gathered in the center of the camp, watching her with eyes that begged for answers. She had none, only instinct, only the sickening certainty that her past had finally come to collect its debt. The Council of Elders stood in a half-circle, waiting. The oldest among them, a woman with silver hair and a face carved by time, spoke quietly. They had no weapons to fight an army, no strength to run. If this force wanted them dead, they would die. If this commander wanted something else, they would have to negotiate. Nora nodded. She understood. Survival meant surrender, or it meant trust. An hour passed, then another. The dust grew so thick it blotted out the sun. And then they came. 500 men on horseback, moving in perfect formation, surrounding the camp in a slow, deliberate circle. They didn't charge. They didn't shout. They simply stopped, forming a wall of horses and muscle and steel that made it clear there was no escape. The riders were a mix of every kind of man Nora had ever seen. Cowboys with sun-scorched faces, former soldiers still wearing pieces of old uniforms, traitors with calculating eyes, men from tribes she recognized and some she didn't. An impossible coalition held together by something stronger than heritage or hatred. Loyalty to him. The circle parted. A single rider moved forward, slowly, deliberately, letting his presence sink into the silence like a blade into flesh. The black horse beneath him was massive, its coat gleaming even under the dust-choked sky. The man wore dark clothing, a long coat that moved with the wind, a hat pulled low enough to shadow his face, but Nora didn't need to see his face. She knew the way he sat in that saddle, the way his shoulders carried weight without bending, the way his silence demanded more attention than any words ever could. Her breath caught. No, it couldn't be. The rider stopped 10 feet from where she stood. Slowly, deliberately, he reached up and removed his hat. The face beneath was older, harder, marked by sun and violence and years that had carved away softness. But the eyes, those eyes hadn't changed. Royce Barrett looked at her the way he had 5 years ago, like she was the only thing in the world that mattered, and the only thing that had ever destroyed him. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. This wasn't possible. Royce Barrett had been nobody, a drifter, a cowboy with nothing but a bedroll and a quiet voice. The man she had rejected because he wasn't strong enough, wasn't respected enough, wasn't enough. The man her people had thrown out of camp like garbage. That man was gone. In his place sat someone who commanded 500 armed riders without saying a word. Someone who had become exactly what she had once told him he could never be. And he had come back for her. The question was why. Royce's voice, when he finally spoke, was low and steady. It carried across the camp like distant thunder. He said her name. Just her name. Nothing more. But the way he said it made her feel like the ground beneath her feet had disappeared. Like the last 5 years had collapsed into this single moment. Like every choice she had ever made had led here, to this reckoning she hadn't seen coming. The elders whispered behind her. The families watched in silence. 500 men sat motionless on 500 horses, waiting for a word from the man who led them. And Nora Redstone, who had survived loss and violence and the slow death of hope, realized something that terrified her more than any army ever could. She had no idea what Royce Barrett wanted. But whatever it was, he had brought enough force to take it, whether she agreed or not. Royce Barrett didn't dismount. He sat on that black horse like a man who had learned patience the hard way, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. Nora felt the weight of 500 pairs of eyes, his men watching, her people watching, everyone waiting to see who would break first. She refused to look away. 5 years ago, she had turned her back on him while the council laughed. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction again, even if her heart was hammering so hard she could barely breathe. He finally spoke, his voice carrying across the camp with unsettling calm. He said he heard about the trouble, the settlers burning homes, the warriors falling one by one. He said he came to offer protection. His men would camp on the ridge, guard the perimeter, make sure no one touched her people again. It sounded like mercy. It sounded too good to be real. Nora's throat tightened. She forced herself to ask the question everyone was thinking. What did he want in return? The corner of Royce's mouth lifted, not quite a smile, more like the ghost of something bitter. He said he wanted to talk. Just the two of them, alone. The elder shifted nervously behind her. One of the older men started to protest, but Nora raised her hand. She knew refusing wasn't an option. Not when 500 armed men surrounded her camp. Not when her people had no other hope. She agreed. Royce swung down from his horse in one fluid motion, handing the reins to a rider beside him without looking. He walked toward the center of camp like he owned it, and Nora hated how familiar his stride still was. Hated that she remembered the way he moved. They walked away from the crowd, past the last row of shelters toward the rocky outcrop where the land dropped into shadow. Neither spoke. The distance between them felt like a canyon neither knew how to cross. When they were far enough that voices wouldn't carry, Royce stopped. He turned to face her, and for the first time in 5 years, they stood close enough to see the damage time had done. Nora saw scars she didn't recognize. A jagged line along his jaw, another across the back of his hand. His eyes were harder, colder, carrying the weight of things she couldn't imagine. She wondered what he saw when he looked at her. Probably the same pride that had sent him away. Probably the same woman who had chosen tradition over the quiet cowboy who loved her. Roy spoke first. He asked if she remembered the last thing she said to him. Nora's chest tightened. She remembered. She had told him he would never be enough. That her people needed strength, not kindness. That a man without a name, without a tribe, without power had no place beside her. The council had agreed. Her promised husband had laughed. And Royce had left without a word, disappearing into the desert like smoke. She asked him why he came back. Royce's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Something raw and unresolved. He said he made a promise to himself the day he left. That if she ever needed him, he would come. No matter what it cost. No matter what it changed. Nora felt her throat close. She wanted to believe it was that simple. That he came out of love, out of loyalty to a memory. But she had seen the way his men moved, the precision, the discipline, the fear in their eyes when they looked at him. This wasn't the quiet cowboy she remembered. This was someone who had built an empire on the bones of his past, someone who commanded through strength, not kindness, the very thing she had once told him he lacked. She asked the question she was terrified to hear answered. Did he come to save her people or to prove she was wrong? Roy stepped closer, close enough that she could smell leather and dust and something else. Something that reminded her of the man he used to be. He said maybe it was both. Maybe he couldn't separate the two anymore. Maybe watching her reject him had broken something inside that never healed right. His voice dropped lower, rougher. He said she wanted a man with power. Now she had one standing in front of her. The question was whether she could live with what that power had cost him to earn. Nora's pulse raced. She didn't know if it was fear or something more dangerous, something that felt like the ghost of what she had felt for him before pride got in the way, before the council's judgment mattered more than her own heart. She opened her mouth to respond, but a shout cut through the air. One of the scouts came running, breathless and wild-eyed. The settlers were moving, a large group, heavily armed, heading straight for the camp. They would arrive by dawn. Royce's expression shifted instantly. No hesitation, no doubt. He turned and whistled, sharp and commanding. Within seconds, his men were in motion, forming defensive positions, checking weapons, moving with the efficiency of a trained force. He looked back at Nora and his voice was steady, unyielding. He told her to get her people to the center of camp, keep them together. No matter what happened, they stayed put. He would handle the rest. She wanted to argue, wanted to demand answers to the 100 questions tearing through her mind, but there was no time. Royce was already walking back toward his men, issuing orders in a tone that left no room for debate. And Nora realized, watching him take command of a situation that should have destroyed them, that she had made a terrible miscalculation 5 years ago. She had thought strength was loud, thought power meant violence and pride. But Royce Barrett had become something far more dangerous. He had learned to carry both without letting either define him. And now her people's survival depended on the man she had once thrown away. The night passed in suffocating tension. Nora gathered her people in the center of camp as Royce had ordered, herding frightened children and exhausted elders into a tight cluster. She posted the few remaining warriors at the inner perimeter, though they all knew it was symbolic. If the settlers broke through Royce's line, nothing would stop the slaughter. Around them, 500 men moved in organized chaos, fortifying positions, setting watch rotations, preparing for violence with the calm efficiency of soldiers who had done this before. Too many times before. Nora couldn't sleep. She stood at the edge of her people's gathering, watching Royce move between his men, checking positions, adjusting strategy. He never raised his voice, never showed doubt. Every man he spoke to nodded and moved without question. She had spent 5 years trying not to think about him, trying to bury the memory of the quiet cowboy who had looked at her like she was something precious. Now she couldn't look away, couldn't stop wondering what had happened in those missing years to turn him into this. Around 3 in the morning, one of Royce's scouts returned from the southern ridge. Nora was close enough to hear the report. 40 settlers, maybe more, armed with rifles and revolvers. They were making camp 2 miles out, waiting for first light, planning to hit the camp when visibility improved and exhaustion made people careless. Royce listened without expression, then gave orders that made Nora's blood run cold. He split his force into 3 groups. The first would hold defensive positions around the camp. The second would circle wide and cut off the settlers' retreat. The third, led by Royce himself, would move in darkness and hit the settlers before dawn. Not defensive, offensive. He was going to strike first. Nora stepped forward before she could stop herself, her voice sharp. She asked if he was planning to slaughter 40 men in their sleep. Royce turned slowly, his eyes unreadable in the firelight. He said no, he was planning to give them a choice. Surrender and leave, or die where they stood. Either way, they wouldn't reach her camp. His tone left no room for moral debate. This wasn't about honor or fairness. This was about survival. She wanted to argue, wanted to say there had to be another way. But the words died in her throat because she knew the truth. Her people had tried negotiation, tried reasoning, tried appealing to mercy, and they had been burned and hunted and slowly destroyed for it. Royce was offering what she couldn't, the willingness to do what needed to be done without hesitation, even if it stained his hands with blood, even if it made him into something darker than the man she remembered. He stepped closer, close enough that his voice was for her alone. He told her he knew what she was thinking, that this wasn't the man she knew 5 years ago, that the quiet cowboy she rejected would never consider violence as the first solution. He was right. That man was gone, died somewhere in the desert when he realized kindness and patience weren't enough to survive in a world that respected only strength. Nora's chest ached. She asked what happened to him out there. What broke him badly enough to become this? Royce's jaw tightened. He said the world did. Said he learned that mercy was a luxury only the strong could afford. And when you have nothing, when you're nobody, mercy just gets you killed. So he stopped offering it, stopped being the man people could ignore or dismiss or reject without consequence. He built something they couldn't ignore, became someone they couldn't dismiss. And if that made him a monster in her eyes, then so be it. At least monsters protect what they care about. Before she could respond, he turned and walked toward his horse. Within minutes, 2/3 of his men were mounted and moving into the darkness, silent as shadows. Nora stood frozen, watching them disappear into the night. Around her, the remaining defenders settled into position, weapons ready, eyes scanning the horizon. Her people huddled together in frightened silence, clinging to children who didn't understand why the adults looked so afraid. She returned to the center of the gathering, sitting beside the elder with silver hair. The old woman looked at her with knowing eyes and asked the question Nora had been avoiding. Did she regret it? Sending Royce away all those years ago? Nora didn't answer immediately. She watched the darkness where Royce had vanished, thinking about the choices that had brought them here. About the moment 5 years ago when she had chosen safety over uncertainty, tradition over risk, a respected warrior over a quiet cowboy with nothing but gentle hands and patient eyes. She had thought she was making the wise choice, the strong choice. Now she wondered if she had just been afraid. Afraid of what loving someone like Royce would cost her. Afraid of standing against her people's expectations. Afraid of choosing something real over something acceptable. The old woman waited, patient and silent. Finally, Nora spoke, her voice barely a whisper. She said she didn't know if regret was the right word, but she knew one thing with crushing certainty. The man who rode away 5 years ago would have died trying to protect her people, and failed. The man who came back tonight would succeed, and she didn't know which truth hurt more. Dawn broke over the ridge in pale gray light. The camp held its collective breath, waiting for gunfire, for screams, for the sound of violence tearing through the morning. Instead, silence. Long, stretching silence that felt worse than any battle. Then slowly shapes appeared on the horizon, riders returning in formation. At the front, on his black horse, Royce Barrett sat tall and uninjured. Behind him, his men rode in organized columns, and between them, on foot, stumbling and exhausted, 40 settlers walked with their hands bound and weapons confiscated. Not dead, disarmed, defeated without a single shot fired. Royce had done exactly what he said he would, given them a choice and made sure they chose surrender. The captured settlers were forced to their knees in front of the entire camp. 40 men, filthy and terrified, staring up at 500 armed riders who surrounded them in a perfect circle. Royce dismounted slowly, walking through the center of the formation with the kind of calm that made Nora's skin prickle. This wasn't theatrics. This was a man who had learned that power meant nothing if people didn't see it, didn't fear it, didn't understand what defying it would cost them. He stopped in front of the lead settler, a thick-necked man with a scar running through his eyebrow. The man tried to hold his gaze, tried to summon defiance, but his hands were shaking. Royce crouched down to eye level, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. He said these men had come to burn homes and kill families, had come to take land that wasn't theirs through violence and intimidation, had come believing there would be no consequences. He paused, letting the silence stretch. Then he stood and addressed the bound men directly. He told them they had one chance to walk away alive. They would leave their weapons, leave their horses, leave the territory, and never return. If any of them came back, if any of them sent others in their place, he would find them. And next time there would be no mercy, no warnings, just graves. The settlers nodded frantically, desperate to agree to anything that meant survival. Royce gestured to his men, who cut the bindings and shoved the prisoners toward the eastern ridge. The settlers stumbled away on foot, casting fearful glances over their shoulders, moving faster as the distance grew. Nora watched them disappear over the horizon, feeling something complicated twist in her chest. Relief that her people were safe, unease at how easily Royce had dismantled 40 armed men without spilling blood, confusion about what kind of man could inspire the loyalty it took to command 500 others without question. As the last settler vanished from view, Royce's men began to disperse, setting up a more permanent camp along the ridge. They moved with practiced efficiency, building fire pits, organizing supply lines, establishing watch rotations. This wasn't temporary. They were planning to stay. Nora approached Royce as he stood near his horse, checking the saddle straps. She asked how long he intended to remain. Royce didn't look up, his hands steady on the leather. He said, as long as it took, until the threat was gone, until her people could defend themselves, until she told him to leave. The last part hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. She asked the question that had been burning in her mind since he arrived. How did a man with nothing build an army? How did the quiet cowboy she rejected become someone who commanded this kind of loyalty? Royce finally looked at her, and for a moment, she saw something unguarded in his eyes, something that looked like exhaustion. He said it started with survival. After he left her camp, he drifted south, taking work where he could find it. Worked ranches, rode security for traders, did things he wasn't proud of when hunger made choices for him. He learned that the world respected strength and crushed weakness, that people followed those who could protect them, feed them, give them purpose. So he started gathering the ones no one else wanted. Drifters, outcasts, men with nowhere to go and nothing to lose. He built trust slowly, one man at a time, proved he could lead by keeping them alive when others would have abandoned them, took on jobs others refused, built a reputation for getting things done, for keeping his word even when it cost him. Royce fell silent for a moment, his eyes distant with memory. Nora waited, sensing there was more to the story, a pivotal moment he hadn't shared. There was a turning point, he finally said, voice low enough that only she could hear. About 2 years after I left your camp, I was working security for a cattle drive in New Mexico territory. Just me and 3 other drifters, all men with nothing left to lose. He absently traced the scar along his jaw, a habit Nora had noticed when he spoke of difficult things. Second night out, we were hit by a gang of rustlers, 15 men, well-armed, organized. They'd been terrorizing the border settlements for months, killed the rancher and his son before we could even respond. Royce's expression hardened. The other guards wanted to run, said we were outnumbered, said it was suicide to fight. They weren't wrong. What did you do? Nora asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. I refused to leave, not out of heroism, out of stubbornness. maybe even spite. A ghost of a bitter smile touched his lips. I'd lost everything once by being seen as weak. I wasn't going to run again, even if it killed me. He looked down at his hands as if seeing them covered in long-dried blood. I told the others they could go. No judgment. But something in my voice, or maybe my eyes, made them stay. We set up an ambush in a narrow pass the rustlers would have to use to move the stolen herd. 4 against 15, Nora said softly. Royce nodded. We shouldn't have surrendered, but desperation makes for creative tactics. We used everything, fire, noise, the terrain itself, made them think they were facing a much larger force. His voice took on a quality she hadn't heard before, not pride exactly, but a grim satisfaction. By dawn, 9 rustlers were dead, the rest scattered, and we'd recovered most of the herd. That's when it started, wasn't it? Nora asked. Your reputation. Word spread. The surviving rustlers talked. Story grew with each telling, as stories do out here. Royce met her eyes directly. 2 weeks later, a rider found me in a saloon in Las Cruces. Former soldier named Gideon Nash. Said he'd heard about what happened at the pass. Said he was tired of drifting, tired of watching men with badges and money run roughshod over those without either. Understanding dawned on Nora's face. He was your first follower, the one who became your second in command. Gideon brought 5 others with him, men like him, skilled, hardened, but without purpose. Royce's voice quieted further. He said something I never forgot. Said, most men want to follow strength, but what they need is to follow conviction. Said he saw both in what I'd done at the pass. Royce straightened, the memory receding as he returned to the present. A month later, we took on a job protecting a small mining settlement from claim jumpers. Succeeded where the local law had failed. After that, our numbers kept growing. Men seeking purpose found us. Men who'd been abandoned by the world and wanted to be part of something that mattered. His eyes held Nora's, suddenly vulnerable beneath the strength. I never set out to build an army. I just wanted to prove, to myself more than anyone, that the quiet cowboy you rejected wasn't weak, just untested. The weight of his words settled between them like stone, heavy with 5 years of purpose driven by both love and pain. Within 2 years, he had 50 men. Within 4, 200. Now 500. All of them willing to ride into danger because they believed in him more than they feared death. Nora listened, trying to reconcile the man describing calculated strategy with the cowboy who used to sit quietly by her fire, content just to be near her. She asked if he ever thought about coming back sooner. Royce was silent for a moment. I needed to become someone who couldn't be dismissed, he said finally, his voice low. Someone who could protect what matters. The simplicity of his answer, free of accusation yet heavy with unspoken history, left Nora without response. She watched him walk away, the weight of 5 years pressing between them like an invisible wall neither knew how to breach. Before the silence could stretch too long, one of the elders approached, asking to speak with Royce privately. He followed the old man toward the council fire, leaving Nora standing alone. She watched him walk away, her mind spinning with too many thoughts. Around her, her people moved with cautious hope, the first ease in their movement she had seen in months. Children laughed. Women prepared food without constantly scanning the horizon for threats. And at the center of it all was the man she had thrown away, holding together their fragile safety with nothing but his will and the loyalty of 500 strangers. She didn't know if what she felt was gratitude or guilt or something far more dangerous. Something that felt disturbingly like the beginning of understanding what she had lost. 3 days passed in uneasy peace. Royce's men maintained their perimeter, rotating shifts with military precision, while Nora's people slowly began to remember what it felt like to sleep without terror. But peace carried its own tension. Every interaction between Nora and Royce felt charged with things neither would say, glances that lasted too long, conversations that ended before they truly began. The weight of 5 years pressing down on both of them like a stone they couldn't move. On the 4th morning, a rider arrived from the east, one of Royce's scouts, moving fast, his horse lathered with sweat. Nora was near the council fire when he dismounted and went straight to Royce, speaking in urgent tones. She moved closer, catching fragments of the conversation. More settlers, not 40 this time, over 100, maybe more. Organized, led by someone who understood tactics. They were gathering at the old fort 20 miles south, preparing for a coordinated assault. This wasn't random violence anymore. This was war. Royce listened without visible reaction, then called his commanders together. Nora watched as they formed a tight circle discussing strategy in low voices. She caught enough to understand the problem. 100 armed men was a force his 500 could handle, but not without casualties, not without risk. And if they engaged in open battle, more would come. The settlers wouldn't stop until they took the land or died trying. This had gone beyond intimidation, beyond shows of force. Someone wanted her people gone badly enough to pay for a small army. The question was who and why. After the commanders dispersed to prepare their men, Royce approached Nora. His expression was grim. He told her they needed to talk about options. Staying and fighting meant bloodshed, and even if they won, it would never end. More would come. Always more. The only way to stop it permanently was to find out who was funding the attacks and eliminate the source. Cut off the head and the body would die, but that meant leaving the camp vulnerable while he took a small force to investigate. It meant risk. It meant trust. He asked if she believed he would come back, if she could trust him not to abandon her people when they needed him most. Nora felt the weight of the question. 5 years ago, she hadn't trusted him with anything, hadn't believed he was capable of protecting what mattered. Now he was asking her to stake her people's survival on that trust, on the belief that the man she rejected had become someone who kept his promises even when it hurt. She met his eyes and said yes. She trusted him, not because of his army or his reputation, but because she had watched him for 4 days and seen something the quiet cowboy used to have. Something she thought was weakness back then, but understood now was strength of a different kind. The ability to care about people who had hurt him, to protect those who had cast him aside, to return for someone who didn't deserve it. Royce's expression shifted, something almost vulnerable flickering across his face before he locked it away. He nodded once, then turned to select 20 men for the mission. They would leave at nightfall, move fast, and return within 3 days. His second-in-command, a scarred veteran named Gideon Nash, would hold the camp if the settlers attacked before Royce returned. Gideon had orders to evacuate everyone to the canyon stronghold 5 miles north. Defensible position, fresh water, enough supplies to last weeks if necessary. Nora listened to the plan, trying to ignore the fear creeping up her spine. 3 days. Anything could happen in 3 days. As evening approached, Royce prepared to leave. He checked his weapons, his supplies, moving with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this too many times to count. Nora found herself standing near his horse, searching for words that wouldn't come. Finally, she asked what he would do if he found whoever was behind the attacks. Royce paused, his hand resting on the saddle. He said he would give them the same choice he gave everyone, walk away or face the consequences. But his tone suggested he already knew which they would choose. That some people only understood violence, only responded to force, and he had learned to speak that language fluently when kindness failed. She asked if that made him feel powerful, if building an empire on fear and loyalty gave him the satisfaction he had been searching for. Royce turned to face her fully, and the look in his eyes was so raw it nearly broke her. He said power didn't make him feel anything except tired, that every man who followed him was a reminder of how broken the world was, how many people had nowhere else to go, how survival required becoming something harder than what you wanted to be. He didn't build this for satisfaction. He built it because when you have nothing, when you're nobody, you either become something that matters or you disappear. And he refused to disappear, refused to let her forget him, refused to prove her right. Before Nora could respond, Royce mounted his horse. His 20 chosen men fell in behind him, silent and ready. He looked down at her one last time, and his voice was quieter than she had heard since he arrived. He told her if something went wrong, if he didn't come back, Gideon would take care of her people. She would be safe. He had made sure of it. Then he turned his horse toward the darkening horizon and rode away, taking 20 men into danger while 500 stayed behind to guard the woman who had once told him he would never be enough. Nora stood watching until the dust settled and the darkness swallowed them whole, feeling the sick certainty that she had finally found the right man at exactly the wrong time. 2 days passed like open wounds. Nora barely slept, standing the watch with Gideon's men, scanning the horizon for threats that never came. The camp held its breath, waiting for either Royce's return or the settler army's arrival. Whichever came first would determine if they lived or died. The children sensed the adults' fear and grew quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold still, as if the land itself was waiting for something terrible to break. On the morning of the third day, Nora stood at the eastern ridge, watching the sun climb over distant hills. Gideon approached, his weathered face unreadable. He said if Royce wasn't back by nightfall, they would evacuate to the canyon stronghold as ordered. It was the smart choice, the safe choice. But it also meant admitting Royce might not be coming back, that the man who commanded 500 through sheer will might have finally met something he couldn't overcome. Nora nodded, not trusting her voice. Gideon studied her for a moment, then spoke quietly. He said Royce had never asked about a woman in all the years he had known him. Never mentioned the pest, never showed weakness, until 4 days ago, when he saw her again. Gideon said whatever happened 5 years ago still mattered, still drove him. And maybe that was why he took the risk of leaving, to prove he could protect her even when she couldn't see him doing it. The words settled heavy in Nora's chest. She wanted to ask more, wanted to understand what Royce had become in the years away from her. But movement on the horizon cut the conversation short. Riders coming fast. Nora's heart stopped. Too few to be the settler army, too fast to be a casual approach. Gideon barked orders, and within seconds, defensive positions locked into place, rifles raised, men in ready. The riders grew closer, and recognition hit like a fist. 20 horses, Royce at the front. But something was wrong. They were riding hard, pushing their mounts to the limit. And behind them, barely visible through the dust, more riders, many more. The settlers had found them. Royce and his men thundered into camp, horses wild-eyed and heaving. He dismounted before his horse fully stopped, already shouting orders. The settlers were an hour behind, maybe less. Over 100 strong, armed for war. They had been waiting near the fort, knowing Royce would come. It was a trap, and he had walked into it. Barely escaped, lost 2 men in the process. Now the enemy knew exactly where to find them. Gideon immediately began evacuation procedures. Families gathered supplies. Children were lifted onto horses, the elderly helped to their feet. Organized chaos fueled by survival instinct. They had maybe an hour to reach the canyon's stronghold before the settlers arrived. Maybe. Royce found Nora in the K, his hand closing around her arm. Not rough, but urgent. He told her to ride with the first group. Get to safety. Don't look back. His men would cover the retreat, hold the settlers long enough for everyone to escape. It was the only way. Nora jerked her arm free, anger flashing hot in her chest. She asked if he planned to die holding them off. If that was his grand solution, sacrifice himself and his men so her people could run. Royce's jaw tightened. He said if that's what it took, yes, that was the whole point. He came back to protect her, to make sure she survived even if he didn't. That was the promise he made to himself 5 years ago, and he kept his promises, even the ones that cost everything. Something broke inside Nora. 5 years of walls, of pride, of convincing herself she made the right choice. Nora grabbed the front of his coat, pulling him close. I don't want your sacrifice, she said, voice fierce despite its trembling. I want you alive. The raw emotion in her words spoke volumes that 5 years of silence couldn't contain. Something shifted in his eyes, understanding perhaps, or recognition of what remained unspoken between them. If you die here, she whispered, I'll never forgive you. Royce stared at her, something fierce and broken warred in his eyes. For a moment, neither moved. The chaos of evacuation swirled around them, but in that small space between breath and heartbeat, there was only the two of them and 5 years of unspoken truth. Then gunfire cracked in the distance. The settlers were closer than expected, their scouts already engaging Royce's rear guard. Time was gone. Royce pulled back, his hand briefly touching her face in a gesture so gentle it felt like goodbye. He told her to ride now, before it was too late. Then he turned and mounted his horse, rallying 50 men to form a defensive line. Nora wanted to scream, wanted to refuse, wanted to do anything except watch him ride towards certain violence. But Gideon was already pulling her toward a horse, and her people needed her. She mounted, taking a terrified child in front of her, and kicked the horse into motion. As the camp fell behind and the canyon stronghold loomed ahead, Nora looked back one last time. She saw Royce and his men forming a line against impossible odds, saw him sitting tall in the saddle, facing the enemy without hesitation. And she understood with devastating clarity that if he died today, she would spend the rest of her life haunted by the man she threw away. The canyon stronghold was exactly what Royce promised: narrow entrance, high walls, fresh water source, and enough space for her people to shelter safely. Gideon's men established defensive positions at the entrance while families settled into the protected interior. Children cried, women held each other, the elderly sat in exhausted silence. Everyone listened to the distant sound of gunfire echoing across the plains. Everyone knew what it meant. Royce and his 50 men were buying time with their lives. Nora paced the canyon entrance like a caged animal, ignoring Gideon's warnings to stay back. She counted the shots, tried to gauge distance, searched the horizon for any sign of movement. Nothing, just smoke rising in the distance and the sickening certainty that men were dying out there because she had made too many wrong choices. The elder with silver hair approached, placing a weathered hand on Nora's shoulder. She said some battles couldn't be won through strength alone, that sometimes survival required accepting help even when pride made it painful. That Royce came back not because she deserved it, but because some people loved in ways that didn't require deserving. The words were meant as comfort. They felt like knives. An hour passed, then two. The gunfire grew sporadic, then stopped altogether. Silence settled over the plains like a burial shroud. Nora's chest constricted. Gideon's men exchanged grim looks. No one spoke the fear everyone shared. Then movement, riders approaching from the west. Gideon raised his rifle, men taking position. The riders came closer, emerging from dust and smoke. Royce's men, alive, bloodied and exhausted. Several wounded but alive, more than alive, victorious. They rode in formation, and behind them, bound and walking, over 60 settlers with their weapons confiscated. The rest had retreated or died trying. Royce rode at the front, his coat torn and bloody, a cut across his forehead still seeping red. But he sat straight in the saddle, eyes scanning the canyon entrance until they found her. The relief that crashed through Nora was so powerful it nearly brought her to her knees. He was alive. Against impossible odds, against a force twice his size, he had survived and brought his men back. Royce dismounted slowly, favoring his left side where his shirt was dark with blood. He gave orders to secure the prisoners, tend the wounded, establish watch rotations. Every word steady and clear despite obvious pain. When the immediate chaos settled, he walked toward Nora with the careful movements of someone holding themselves together through sheer will. She met him halfway, her hands hovering near his injuries, not knowing where to touch that wouldn't hurt. She asked how bad it was. Royce said he'd been worse. The cut on his forehead was shallow. The wound in his side would heal. He had lost 3 more men, good men who deserved better than dying for someone else's land dispute. But they had broken the settler force, captured enough to negotiate from strength, and discovered who was funding the attacks. A land speculator from the east buying violence wholesale, trying to clear the territory for railroad expansion. Rich man playing chess with other people's lives. Nora listened, but all she could focus on was the blood still seeping through his shirt, the exhaustion carved into his face, the weight he carried that never seemed to lighten. She told him to sit down before he fell down. Royce started to argue, but his legs betrayed him, buckling slightly. Nora caught his arm, steadying him. And for the first time since he returned with 500 men, he let her. Let himself be vulnerable. Let himself need help. She guided him to a flat stone near the water source and carefully removed his coat. The wound in his side was deep but clean, would need stitching, would leave another scar to add to the collection. As she cleaned the blood, her hands steady despite the emotions churning inside her, Royce watched her in silence. Finally he spoke, his voice rough with fatigue. He said he found the speculator's location 40 miles south in a fortified compound. The man had hired the settlers, paid them gold to drive her people out or exterminate them. Royce planned to ride there tomorrow with 200 men. Not to kill, to negotiate. The speculator wanted land. Royce would offer him a choice: withdraw the contract and leave the territory, or face 500 angry men who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. Money couldn't buy loyalty like that. Couldn't buy men willing to die for a cause. The speculator would fold. They always did when faced with real consequences. Nora paused in her work, meeting his eyes. She asked what happened after that. After the threat was gone and her people were safe, what happened to him and his 500 men? Where did they go when there was nothing left to fight? Royce's expression shifted, something unguarded and uncertain replacing his usual confidence. He said he didn't know. For 5 years he had moved from one crisis to another, built an empire on being needed, on having purpose. But eventually the fighting stopped. Eventually peace came, and he had no idea who he was in a world without conflict. No idea if the man he had become could exist in calm, or if he had traded too much of himself for strength to ever find his way back. Nora finished cleaning the wound and began stitching it closed, each pull of thread deliberate and careful. She told him maybe he didn't need to find his way back. Maybe the quiet cowboy she knew and the man who commanded armies weren't as different as he thought. Maybe strength wasn't about choosing between kindness and force. Maybe it was about knowing when each was needed. And maybe the man who could build loyalty through trust and protect people who hurt him was exactly who he was always meant to become. She just hadn't been wise enough to see it 5 years ago. Royce reached up, his hand covering hers, stilling her work. He asked if that meant she saw it now. If after everything, after watching him become something harder and more dangerous, she could still be the man he was underneath. The man who never stopped loving her, even when it would have been easier to hate. Nora's hands trembled as she tied off the last stitch. She didn't pull away, neither did Royce. His question hung between them, raw and vulnerable in a way that made her chest ache. Could she see the man he was underneath everything he had become? She looked at him, really looked, at the scars and exhaustion and quiet strength that had carried him through 5 years of building something from nothing. She said yes. She saw him. Saw the cowboy who used to sit by her fire without needing words. Saw the man who came back not for revenge, but because he made a promise. Saw someone who learned to be dangerous without losing the part of himself that still cared. And she was sorry. Sorry for not seeing it 5 years ago. Sorry for choosing safety over truth. Sorry for making him prove his worth when he had always been enough. Royce closed his eyes, something breaking loose in his expression. When he opened them again, they were wet. He said he spent 5 years becoming someone she couldn't reject, building power so no one could dismiss him again. But standing here, wounded and exhausted, letting her see him weak, this felt more terrifying than any battle. Because if she rejected him now, after everything, there would be nothing left to become, nowhere left to run. Nora leaned forward, her forehead resting against his. She told him she wasn't rejecting him. Not now, not ever again. If he would have her, despite the years lost, despite the pain her choice caused, despite everything she didn't deserve. Royce's hand came up to cup her face, thumb brushing across her cheek. He said there was nothing to forgive, that loving her had made him better even when it hurt, that every man he saved, every person he protected carried the echo of what he felt for her. She had shaped him more than she knew, made him want to be someone worth coming back to. And now, finally, he was. The kiss was inevitable, gentle despite years of separation, carrying the weight of everything unspoken. When they pulled apart, both were breathing hard, and the world felt different, smaller, like the distance between them had finally collapsed. The next morning, Royce rode south with 200 men. Not for war, for negotiation. Nora watched him leave, but this time without fear. This time, she knew he would return. The prisoners were kept under guard, isolated from the women and children. Nora moved among her people, helping establish a temporary home in the canyon stronghold. There was talk of returning to their original camp, but Royce had advised against it until the threat was completely neutralized. The land speculator might have more men, more resources. Better to wait. As evening approached, Nora found herself sitting with Gideon near the canyon entrance. The grizzled second-in-command was cleaning his rifle, movements precise and methodical. She asked how he had come to follow Royce. Gideon's hands never paused in their work as he spoke. He said he had been a sergeant in the Union Army during the Civil War. After the fighting ended, he had nowhere to go, no family to return to. He drifted west, working as a hired gun, drinking too much, waiting for the bullet that would finally end the nightmares of Antietam and Gettysburg. Then he met Royce. Not the man he was now, just a quiet cowboy with observant eyes and a talent for calming horses. They rode together for a month, guarding a cattle drive. Gideon was still drinking then, still dangerous, unpredictable. One night, drunk and lost in memory, he pulled his gun on a young ranch hand who'd startled him. Would have killed the boy if Royce hadn't stepped between them. He remembered Royce's voice, calm, steady, not afraid, even with a loaded pistol aimed at his chest, just talking him back to the present, keeping him there until the rage and terror passed, until his hand steadied enough to lower the gun. The next morning, Royce didn't mention it, didn't judge or lecture, just asked if Gideon wanted something better than dying drunk in a forgotten saloon. Said he was gathering men who needed purpose. Men like them. That was 4 years ago. Gideon hadn't touched a bottle since. When Nora asked what changed Royce, what turned the quiet cowboy into the commander of 500, Gideon's expression darkened. He said it happened about a year after they started riding together. They were 15 men then, working legitimate jobs mostly, building a reputation for reliability. They took a contract protecting a small settlement of farmers south of the border. Decent people trying to scratch a living from unforgiving land. A local warlord wanted their water rights, sent 30 men to persuade them. Royce tried to negotiate, tried to find a compromise, tried everything but violence. The warlord took it for weakness, attacked at dawn, killed half the farmers before Royce and his men could respond. They won that fight, but barely. Lost 5 good men. And watching those farmers bury their dead, men, women, even children, something changed in Royce. The quiet cowboy realized the world didn't respect decency, didn't reward restraint, understood that power was the only language some men recognized. So he learned to speak it, built his force, developed a reputation that made most men think twice before crossing him, made sure the next time someone threatened innocence under his protection, they understood exactly what it would cost them. Gideon finished cleaning his rifle and looked directly at Nora. He said she should know that everything Royce had become, he became because of her. Not despite her rejection, but because of it. He took that pain and used it to build something extraordinary, something that had saved more lives than Gideon could count. He asked her not to waste that, not to make the same mistake twice. Before Nora could respond, a commotion at the canyon entrance drew their attention. One of the prisoners, a lean man with a hawk-like face, was demanding to speak with whoever was in charge. Said he had information they needed to hear. Information about the speculators' real plans. Gideon and Nora exchanged glances. It could be a trap, a desperate ploy, but they couldn't afford to ignore any potential intelligence. Gideon nodded to the guards who brought the prisoner forward, hands still bound. The man's name was Harlan Weaver. He'd been the speculator's bookkeeper before being sent to fight. He claimed the man they were dealing with, William Thornton, railroad magnate and land investor, wouldn't negotiate, wouldn't back down, had too much at stake. Because it wasn't just about the railroad, it was about what was beneath the land. Oil. Thornton's engineers had discovered signs of a massive oil field stretching under the canyon territories. Worth millions. Worth killing for. And Thornton had already invested too much to walk away, no matter how many men Royce brought to his doorstep. Worse, he had connections in Washington. Political influence. A telegram had already been sent requesting military intervention against hostile Indians threatening American expansion. Troops could arrive within weeks. Nora felt her blood turn cold. Royce was riding into more than a negotiation. He was riding into a trap. And by the time he discovered it, it might be too late. Gideon was already on his feet, barking orders. They needed to send riders to warn Royce, needed to prepare for a larger battle than they had anticipated, needed to get ready to move if the military actually responded to Thornton's lies. As men scrambled to saddle horses, Nora grabbed Weaver's arm. She asked why he was telling them this, what he gained from betraying Thornton. The man's eyes were hollow with something that looked like shame. He said he'd joined Thornton's operation for the money. Thought he was just helping push reluctant landowners into selling. Didn't realize he was participating in murder until it was too late to walk away clean. Said he had a daughter back east. Wanted to be able to look her in the eye someday. wanted to be able to tell her he finally did something right, even if it cost him everything else. Nora believed him, the kind of lie that complex didn't come easily, not with fear still etched in the lines around his eyes. She nodded to Gideon, who assigned 4 riders to head south immediately. Their fastest horses, their best men. They might catch Royce before he reached Thornton's compound, might be able to warn him of what he was truly facing. Or they might not. As night fell over the canyon, Nora stood at the entrance, watching the riders disappear into darkness. Behind her, the camp buzzed with renewed anxiety. The brief peace shattered by the revelation that their enemy was more powerful, more determined than they had believed. The silver-haired elder joined her, wrapped in a blanket against the evening chill. The old woman didn't speak for a long time, just stood beside her, watching the same darkness. Finally, she said the spirits had been testing Nora, testing her ability to recognize true strength when it stood before her, testing her courage to accept help without letting pride stand in the way, testing her heart to see if she could love a man who had changed so deeply it scared her. Nora asked if she was still being tested. The elder smiled, sad and knowing. She said the hardest test was still to come, because true love wasn't just recognizing worth. It was fighting for it, even when the odds seemed impossible, even when fighting meant risking everything you had left. She asked if Nora was ready for that, ready to ride into danger for the man she once sent away, ready to show him that whatever he had become, whatever he had built, she was his equal in courage and determination. Nora looked at the canyon around her, at her people settling in for an uneasy night, at the children who still had futures because Royce Barrett had kept his promise, at the prisoners who lived because he chose mercy over vengeance, at the men who followed him because he gave them purpose when the world had none to offer. And she knew what she had to do. She would not wait here, safe in the canyon, while Royce faced Thornton alone, would not hide behind the protection he provided without standing beside him when he needed her most, would not repeat the mistake of letting him walk away without knowing exactly what he meant to her. As dawn broke, Nora prepared to leave. She selected 10 warriors, the strongest who remained among her people, explained her plan, told them she understood if they refused. This wasn't their fight, wasn't their debt to pay. Every one of them agreed to ride with her. Gideon tried to stop her, said Royce would never forgive him if he let her ride into danger, said his orders were to keep her safe, keep her people protected. Nora told him that for 5 years, men had been deciding what was best for her, telling her what strength looked like, defining her worth by their standards. She was done with that, done letting others choose her path, done hiding behind safety when courage was required. She was going to find Royce, going to stand with him against Thornton, going to prove that whatever he had become for her sake, she could become for his. And if Gideon tried to stop her, he would discover that Apache women knew how to fight just as fiercely as any man. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. Then he laughed. A real laugh, rough with surprise and something like respect. He said Royce had been right about her all along, said she was exactly the woman he described during those rare nights when the quiet cowboy would speak of his past. He wouldn't stop her, but he wouldn't let her go alone either. He assigned 20 of his best men to accompany her. Men who knew the territory. Men who could get her to Thornton's compound alive. As they rode out from the canyon, Nora felt fear and something stronger beating in her chest. Felt the weight of 5 years of regret lifting with every mile that brought her closer to Royce. Felt the certainty that whatever happened next, she would not make the same mistake twice. She would not let the man she loved face his demons alone. The journey to Thornton's compound tested every limit of endurance. 30 riders, Nora, her 10 warriors, and Gideon's 20 men pushed their mounts hard across unforgiving terrain. They rode through the scorching heat of noon and into the chill of desert night, stopping only when the horses demanded rest. Gideon set a punishing pace. If they were to have any chance of reaching Royce before he confronted Thornton, they couldn't afford caution. Not now. As they rode, Nora's mind churned with questions she had no answers for. What would they find at the compound? Had their messengers reached Royce in time? Was he already negotiating, unaware of the true threat? Or worse, had he walked into a trap he couldn't escape? During a brief stop to water the horses, Gideon approached her. His face was grim beneath the layer of trail dust. Thornton's compound is a fortress, he said, built during the border conflicts. Stone walls, guard towers, enough supplies to withstand a siege for months. You've seen it? Nora asked. Gideon nodded. 2 years back, Royce and I scouted it when we heard rumors about a man building a private army down south. We decided he wasn't worth confronting then. And now? Now Royce is riding toward it with 200 men, thinking he's facing a businessman who'll fold under pressure. Not a fortress held by a man willing to commit genocide for oil. Gideon's voice was flat. If our messengers didn't reach him, he's riding into slaughter. Nora felt her stomach knot. Then we need to move faster. The horses won't, then we leave the weakest behind. Take only those who can keep up. Her eyes hardened. I won't lose him, Gideon. Not again. Something like respect flickered in the veteran's eyes. He nodded once, then turned to select the horses that could maintain the grueling pace. They rode on, a smaller party now, 20 riders on the strongest mounts, pushing toward a confrontation none of them were certain they would survive. As the sun began to set on their second day of hard riding, they crested a ridge, and Gideon raised his hand, signaling a halt. Below them, perhaps 2 miles distant, a plume of dust marked the passage of a large group of riders moving north toward them. Get down, Gideon hissed, and they all dismounted, crouching low against the skyline. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs. Were those Royce's men returning after the negotiation? Or Thornton's forces moving to attack the canyon stronghold while Royce was distracted elsewhere? Gideon produced a brass spyglass and extended it, focusing on the distant riders. His expression gave nothing away. After a moment, he handed the glass to Nora without a word. She raised it to her eye, adjusting until the riders came into focus. And there, at the front of the column, a figure on a black horse that she would recognize anywhere. Royce, alive, riding north with what looked like all 200 of his men. Relief crashed through her so powerfully she nearly dropped the spyglass. But as she steadied herself and looked again, she realized something was wrong. The men weren't riding in their usual disciplined formation. They were scattered, disorganized. Some were slumped in their saddles. Others rode double, supporting wounded companions. This wasn't a victorious return. This was a retreat. She lowered the spyglass and met Gideon's eyes. He had seen it too. Something went wrong, he said quietly. Before she could respond, one of her Apache warriors signaled from further along the ridge. More dust coming from the south. Another group of riders, moving fast, trailing Royce's men by perhaps an hour. Gideon raised the spyglass again. His curse was soft but vicious. Thornton's men, he said. At least 100, maybe more. They're pursuing Royce. Nora made the calculation in an instant. Royce's 200, some of them wounded, against a fresh force of 100. Under normal circumstances, the odds would favor Royce. But his men were clearly exhausted, perhaps low on ammunition after whatever confrontation had already occurred. This wasn't a fight they were guaranteed to win. We need to warn them, she said, and we need to prepare an ambush for their pursuers. Gideon looked at her with new eyes. You're suggesting we attack Thornton's men from behind while Royce engages them from the front. I'm suggesting we place Thornton's men between two forces they don't expect. Nora's voice was steady, certain. Cut off their retreat, force them to surrender or die. A slow smile spread across Gideon's weathered face. Royce said you were smart, didn't mention you were a tactician. My father was a war chief before the settlers came. He taught me more than how to weave baskets. She turned to her warriors, giving orders in their native tongue. They nodded and began preparing their weapons. Gideon watched, then spoke to his own men. We'll split. 10 of us will ride ahead to warn Royce. The rest stay with Miss Redstone and prepare the ambush. One of the men, a former cavalry scout with a burned scar covering half his face, frowned. Boss said we're to protect her at all costs. And you will, Gideon replied, by helping her spring this trap. Or would you rather explain to Royce how you let his woman ride into battle alone because you were too scared to follow her lead? That settled it. The men divided as ordered. Gideon and 9 others mounted up to intercept Royce, while Nora and the remaining fighters moved their horses into a sheltered draw and began preparing the ambush. The ridge provided perfect cover. A narrow pass between two rocky outcroppings meant Thornton's men would be channeled into a bottleneck, unable to use their superior numbers effectively. If they could lure them into the pass while Royce turned his forces to meet them head-on, Thornton's men would be trapped. As they worked, setting up firing positions and preparing emergency signals, one of Gideon's men, a former buffalo hunter named Eli, approached Nora. "I rode with Royce almost from the beginning," he said, checking the action on his Winchester. "Never seen him retreat from anything. Whatever happened at that compound, it must have been bad." Nora's hand stilled on her own rifle. "Do you think Thornton rejected the negotiation?" Eli snorted. "Men like Thornton don't negotiate unless they're scared, and men with fortresses and private armies don't scare easy." He glanced at her. "You should know, Royce wouldn't have retreated to save himself. Only reason he'd pull back is if he thought it was the only way to protect his men, or if he learned something that made him realize the real battle was elsewhere." "Like what?" "Don't know, but I've seen Royce make hard calls before. One, sacrifice position for advantage. Retreat today to win tomorrow." Eli's eyes narrowed as he scanned the horizon. "Whatever his reason, I trust it." Trust. The words settled in Nora's chest like a stone. 5 years ago, she hadn't trusted Royce with anything that mattered. Now she was trusting him with her life, with her people's future. The irony wasn't lost on her. The sun sank lower, painting the land in gold and shadow. From their position, they could see dust on the northern horizon where Gideon's party had intercepted Royce's column. The dust cloud changed direction slightly. They were turning, preparing to engage. "Get ready," Nora called. "They'll be coming through the pass soon." Her warriors took position behind boulders and scrub, rifles ready. Gideon's men found their own cover, spreading out to create a crossfire. Nora herself crouched behind a large rock that gave her clear view of the pass entrance. Her hands were steady on her rifle, her breathing calm. The fear was still there, but something stronger had taken control. Determination. Clarity. For the first time since Royce had returned with his army, she wasn't just reacting to his protection. She was standing as his equal, fighting alongside him rather than hiding behind his strength. It felt right in a way nothing had in years. The distant thunder of hooves grew louder. Dust rose from the southern approach to the pass. Thornton's men were coming, unaware of the trap closing around them. Nora raised her hand, signaling her warriors to hold fire until her command. Opposite her, she saw Eli doing the same with Gideon's men. Then the first riders appeared at the mouth of the pass, hard-faced men with rifles at the ready, pushing their horses at a gallop. Behind them came more and more, until the narrow passage was filled with pounding hooves and dust. And from the northern end of the pass came a sound that made Nora's heart leap. Royce's distinctive whistle, followed by the battle cry of 200 riders charging head-on toward Thornton's forces. Caught between two forces, the pursuing riders pulled up short, horses rearing in confusion. Their leader, a tall man with a silver-streaked beard, shouted orders, trying to reorganize his men for the unexpected threat. That was when Nora dropped her arm, giving the signal. 20 rifles fired as one from the ridge. The ambush was devastating. Thornton's men had nowhere to run, nowhere to seek cover. Caught in the open between three forces, they were completely exposed. Men fell from saddles. Horses screamed in panic. Confusion turned to chaos as they realized they were surrounded. And through the dust and gun smoke, Nora saw a familiar figure on a black horse, riding at the head of the charging column from the north. Royce, his hat gone, his coat torn, a bandage visible around his upper arm, but unmistakably alive and fighting. The battle, if it could be called that, was over in minutes. Thornton's men, realizing they were hopelessly outmatched, threw down their weapons. Their leader tried to rally them for one final stand, but found himself staring down the barrel of Royce's revolver before he could fire a shot. As the last of the resistance collapsed, Nora descended from her position on the ridge. Royce's men were securing prisoners, collecting weapons, tending to the few wounded on their side. The ambush had been so complete that they had suffered almost no casualties. She moved through the crowd of horse and men searching for one face. And then the crowd parted, and he was there. Royce dismounted slowly, wincing as his boots hit the ground. The bandage around his arm was stained with fresh blood. His face was streaked with dust and sweat, a new cut visible along his hairline. But his eyes, when they found her, burned with an intensity that took her breath away. He walked toward her with that same measured stride she remembered, the quiet confidence that had always been his, even before he commanded armies. She met him halfway, stopping just short of touching him, suddenly uncertain. "You're supposed to be safe in the canyon," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "And you're supposed to be negotiating, not retreating from a battle." She gestured to his wounded arm. "What happened?" His jaw tightened. Thornton had no interest in negotiation. He had artillery waiting for us, Gatling guns, military-grade weapons no land speculator should have access to. Royce's eyes darkened. "We walked into an ambush. Lost 17 men before we could even respond." Nora felt her blood run cold. "Weaver told us about the oil, about Thornton's connections in Washington." "Weaver?" "One of the prisoners, Thornton's former bookkeeper. He said it wasn't just about the railroad. There's oil under the canyon territories. Thornton's already wired Washington asking for military intervention against hostile Indians." Understanding dawned in Royce's eyes. That's why he was willing to face us. He knew government troops would be coming to finish what he started. "How long do we have?" "Weeks, maybe. Depends on how much influence he really has." Royce's gaze swept over the captured men, the battlefield, though I doubt he expected to lose his entire pursuing force. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "That was your plan, wasn't it?" "The ambush." She nodded. It seemed like the most efficient way to end this without more bloodshed on either side. Efficient is one word for it. He looked at her with something like wonder. "You saved a lot of lives today, Nora, mine included. Consider it payment toward a debt I've owed 4 or 5 years." His expression softened, the hard lines of command easing into something more vulnerable. "There's never been any debt between us. Just choices, yours and mine." Before she could respond, Gideon approached, leading a prisoner. The man's fine clothes were now dust-covered and torn, his face pale beneath a well-trimmed beard. "Found this one trying to slip away during the surrender," Gideon said, shoving the man forward. "Thought you'd want to meet William Thornton face to face." The land speculator stumbled, catching himself before he fell. He straightened, attempting to reclaim some dignity despite his circumstances. His eyes moved from Royce to Nora and back, assessing, calculating. "Mr. Barrett," and he said, his voice cultured, Eastern, "I see you've made some unexpected alliances." Royce's expression hardened. "And I see you've miscalculated severely." "Have I?" Thornton smiled thinly. "You've captured me, congratulations. But my telegram to Washington was sent 3 days ago. The military will respond. They always do when American business interests are threatened by local resistance." He glanced dismissively at Nora and her warriors. "The territory is already mapped for development. The treaties are being rewritten as we speak. This land will be cleared, Mr. Barrett, with or without my personal involvement." Nora felt rage rising in her throat, but Royce's voice cut through, calm and certain. "You're assuming the military will respond to your specific request rather than a competing one." He nodded to Gideon, who produced a folded paper from his coat. "This telegraph was sent yesterday from Fort Benton by Captain James Hollister, 7th Cavalry, an old friend who owed me a favor." Royce took the paper and read aloud. "Investigation confirms Thornton operation illegal. Stop. Land claims fraudulent. Stop. Tribe holds valid treaty rights. Stop. Requesting authorization to arrest Thornton and associates for multiple violations of federal law. Stop." Thornton's face drained of color. "You're bluffing. Hollister wouldn't—" "Hollister was at Wounded Knee," Royce cut in, his voice hardening. "He's spent every day since trying to atone for following orders that led to massacre. When I showed him evidence of your plan to manufacture a similar incident, he was more than willing to intervene." He stepped closer to Thornton, and despite the speculator's height advantage, it was clear which man held the true power. "The military is coming, Thornton, but not to help you, to arrest you. For fraud, for inciting violence, for attempting to provoke armed conflict for personal gain." Thornton's composure cracked. "You can't prove any of that. Your bookkeeper already provided evidence. Your private correspondence, financial records showing payments to men who attacked peaceful settlements, maps of oil deposits you plan to exploit after the tribe was eliminated." Royce's voice remained calm, but his eyes were merciless. By this time tomorrow, every newspaper from here to Washington will have the story. Businessman attempts genocide for oil profits. How do you think that will play in the Senate chambers where your friends hold influence? For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Thornton's face, real fear replacing calculation. Those papers were locked in my office safe. How did you? You hired men for loyalty to money. I command men loyal to something stronger. Royce gestured to where his forces had gathered, watching the confrontation in silence. While we engaged your guards at the front gate, a small team entered through the unguarded eastern wall. The wall you thought was impenetrable because it faces the cliff drop. His mouth quirked. Turns out, men who grew up climbing canyon walls don't find 60-foot cliffs particularly challenging. Understanding dawned in Thornton's eyes. The frontal assault was a distraction. A costly one, Royce acknowledged grimly, but effective. Thornton stared at him, then did something unexpected. He laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. You know nothing about sacrifice, Barrett. Nothing about what it takes to build something that lasts. Enlighten me, Royce said coldly. My father died in a mining accident when I was 7, crushed under a mountain owned by a man who never set foot in his own mines. Thornton's cultured veneer cracked, revealing something raw beneath. Mother took in laundry. I delivered newspapers at dawn, worked factory floors after school, watched men with soft hands and Harvard accents buy and sell the lives of people like my father without a second thought. He straightened, defiance replacing fear. I swore I'd become one of them. And I did. Worked my way through school, married into the right family, learned their rules, beat them at their own game. 20 years of sacrifice, of becoming something I despised so I could change things from the inside. By becoming the very monster you once hated, Nora spoke up, her voice cutting through his justifications. By planning the deaths of my people, mothers, children, for profit? Thornton's eyes flickered to her, then away. There are always casualties in progress. The railroad will connect this territory to markets back east. The oil will heat homes, power industry. Thousands will benefit. At the cost of our lives, Nora said, our history belongs to those who write it. Thornton's mask slipped back into place, the momentary vulnerability gone. And those who write it are the ones who win. Then it's fortunate, Royce said, his voice deceptively gentle, that you won't be doing either. He turned to Gideon. Secure him with the others. We ride for Fort Benton at first light to deliver our prisoners. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Thornton's face, real fear replacing calculation. Those papers were locked in my office safe. How did you? You hired men for loyalty to money. I command men loyal to something stronger. Royce gestured to where his forces had gathered, watching the confrontation in silence. While we engaged your guards at the front gate, a small team entered through the unguarded eastern wall. The wall you thought was impenetrable because it faces the cliff drop. His mouth quirked. Turns out, men who grew up climbing canyon walls don't find 60-foot cliffs particularly challenging. Understanding dawned in Thornton's eyes. The frontal assault was a distraction, a costly one, Royce acknowledged grimly, but effective. Your papers are now in Captain Hollister's possession. Your operation is exposed. Your political allies will be distancing themselves by morning. He turned to Gideon. Secure him with the others. We ride for Fort Benton at first light to deliver our prisoners. As Gideon led the stunned speculator away, Royce sagged slightly, the momentary strength of confrontation fading. Nora moved to his side, supporting him with a hand under his elbow. You need rest, she said quietly, and that arm needs proper tending. He didn't argue, allowing her to lead him toward where the men were establishing camp for the night. As they walked, she asked the question burning in her mind. You knew, didn't you, before you even rode to Thornton's compound? You knew it was a trap. Royce was silent for several steps. Then, I suspected. The force he sent against the camp was too well equipped, too organized for a simple land grab. Someone was financing a small war. So you rode into an ambush deliberately? Risked your men's lives on a suspicion? I rode in with 2 plans. His voice was weary but certain. The first was legitimate negotiation, if Thornton proved reasonable. The second was infiltration to gather evidence while we provided a distraction. They reached a quiet corner of the camp where someone had already laid out bedrolls in the shelter of a large boulder. Royce sank down, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. I didn't expect the artillery, he admitted. That was a miscalculation, one that cost good men their lives. Nora knelt beside him, gently unwinding the crude bandage from his arm. The wound beneath was ugly, a deep graze that had torn through muscle. Not life-threatening if infection was prevented, but certainly painful. As she cleaned the wound with water from her canteen, she asked, "Why didn't you tell me your suspicions? Why leave me thinking you were just going to talk?" Royce's eyes met hers, complicated emotions swirling in their depths. "Would you have let me go if you knew I was riding into potential slaughter?" "No," she admitted. "I would have tried to stop you. And I would have gone anyway, because it needed to be done." His voice softened. "I didn't want to put you in the position of watching me ride away knowing I might not come back. So instead you left me to wonder, to worry, to imagine every terrible possibility while I waited helplessly in the canyon." Her hand stilled on his wound. "That's not protection, Royce, that's control." He flinched as if she'd struck him. "I never meant—" "I know, but intentions don't change outcomes." She resumed cleaning his wound, her touch still gentle despite her words. "5 years ago, the council decided I shouldn't be with you because you weren't strong enough. I let them make that choice for me because I was afraid to trust my own judgment." She looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "I won't make that mistake again. Not with you, not with anyone. I won't be protected by being kept ignorant. I won't be sheltered by being denied choice." For a long moment, Royce was silent, his face unreadable in the gathering dusk. Then slowly he nodded. "You're right," he said simply. "I've spent 5 years becoming strong enough to protect you. But in the process, I almost became the very thing I despised. Someone who would control you for your own good." His voice roughened. "I'm sorry, Nora." The raw honesty in his words touched something deep inside her. This was the man she had glimpsed beneath the quiet Cowboys reserve 5 years ago, capable of growth, of self-reflection, of changing course when shown a truth he hadn't seen. "We both have apologies to make," she said softly, "and time to make them. But first you need rest." She finished bandaging his arm and moved to rise, but his hand caught hers, holding her in place. His touch was warm despite his exhaustion, his fingers curling around hers with gentle insistence. "When I saw you coming down that ridge," he said, voice low and intimate in the gathering darkness, "leading warriors into battle like you were born for it, I realized something I should have known 5 years ago." "What's that?" "You never needed my protection. You needed a partner. Someone who would stand beside you, not in front of you." His thumb traced a small circle on the back of her hand. "I just hope I haven't forgotten how to be that man after all this time commanding from the front." Nora felt warmth spreading through her chest, chasing away the last chill of fear and uncertainty. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his in the gesture of her people, an intimacy deeper than a kiss, the sharing of breath and thought. "You haven't forgotten," she whispered. "You just needed someone to remind you." They stayed that way for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, reconnecting across the void of 5 lost years. Then voices nearby broke the spell, Gideon, organizing watch rotations for the night. Nora pulled back reluctantly. "Rest," she said again. "Tomorrow brings new battles." Royce nodded, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "And we'll face them together." As she moved to join Gideon in organizing the camp, Nora felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. The weight of regret of what might have been had lifted from her shoulders. Whatever came next, whether facing Thornton's political allies, military intervention, or the uncertain future of her people, she would not face it alone. And neither would Royce. Dawn broke over the battlefield with pale golden light. The camp stirred early, preparing to move their prisoners to Fort Benton, where Captain Hollister waited. Royce was already up when Nora emerged from her bedroll, conferring with Gideon and other lieutenants, issuing orders with his usual quiet authority. His arm was still bandaged, but he moved with more ease than the previous evening. Rest had restored some of his strength, though shadows of exhaustion still lingered beneath his eyes. As Nora approached, he turned to her with a nod of acknowledgement. We'll move out within the hour. 30 men will escort the prisoners to the fort. The rest will return with us to the canyon stronghold. Us? She questioned. If you'll permit me to accompany you. Something vulnerable flickered in his eyes, gone almost before she could name it. I'd like to see your people safely returned to their homes once we're certain the threat is gone. She recognized what it cost him to phrase it as a request rather than a command or a statement of intent. This was Royce Barrett, leader of 500, asking permission rather than assuming right. I'd welcome your company, she replied simply. Relief softened his features momentarily before he turned back to his commanders, finalizing details for the journey ahead. As the camp broke down around them, Nora found herself standing with Gideon near the horses. The grizzled veteran was checking his mount's saddle girth, his movements practiced and efficient. He's different with you, Gideon said without looking up. Softer, more like the man I first met. Nora watched Royce across the camp, directing his men with the calm certainty that had become his hallmark. Is that a good thing in your estimation? Gideon straightened, considering the question with unexpected seriousness. Depends. The man he became kept a lot of people alive, including me. Built something important out of nothing but grit and reputation. He glanced at her. But that man was also alone, isolated by a command, driven by ghosts he never talked about. He patted his horse's neck absently. The quiet cowboy I met years back, he had a peace to him. Something settled in his soul despite having nothing to his name. That disappeared after he trailed off, uncomfortable. After I rejected him, Nora finished for him. Gideon nodded. Not saying it was your fault, just how it was. His weathered face creased in thought. Maybe the best outcome isn't him going back to who he was, or staying who he became. Maybe it's finding something in between. Strong enough to lead, but gentle enough to love. The simplicity and insight of his words struck Nora deeply. Before she could respond, a commotion at the edge of camp drew their attention. A rider was approaching at speed, his horse nearly spent. Royce moved to intercept, hand resting on his holstered revolver. The camp stilled, everyone watching as the lone rider pulled his exhausted mount to a stop before their leader. Even from a distance, Nora could see the man was one of Royce's. His clothing and bearing marked him as part of their company. He leaned down from the saddle, speaking urgently to Royce, whose expression darkened with each passing second. Nora and Gideon exchanged glances, then moved toward the pair as Royce helped the exhausted rider dismount. What's happened? Gideon demanded as they approached. Royce's face was like stone, his eyes cold with a rage Nora had never seen before. The canyon stronghold was attacked last night, a force of about 50 men, not Thornton's. Mercenaries hired by someone else. Horror washed through Nora. My people. Most are safe, Royce said quickly, placing a steadying hand on her arm. They were warned in time to retreat deeper into the canyon system. But they're trapped now. The mercenaries are holding the main entrance. Who would do this? Nora asked, struggling to make sense of this new threat. If Thornton is captured. Thornton had partners, the rider cut in, his voice ragged with exhaustion. Eastern investors with millions at stake in the railroad and oil rights. One of them decided to eliminate the problem directly rather than wait for military intervention. Gideon swore softly. How do you know this? They left a message, Royce said, his voice dangerously quiet. For me specifically. He handed Nora a crumpled piece of paper. The message was brief, written in an elegant hand. Mr. Barrett, your interference has become intolerable. Thornton was a fool to engage you directly. I prefer efficiency. The Apache problem will be resolved by the time you receive this, either through surrender or extermination. Your reputation may be fearsome on the frontier, but in the corridors of Washington and Wall Street, you are nothing but an inconvenience to be eliminated. Consider this a courtesy notice that your services are no longer required in this territory. Return east of the Mississippi within 30 days, or face prosecution for crimes we will have no difficulty manufacturing evidence for. Cordially, JWH. Nora felt her blood turn to ice as she read the cold, calculated threat. These weren't settlers acting out of fear or greed. This was power of a different kind, distant, impersonal, wielded by men who never had to see the consequences of their decisions. JWH, she read aloud. Who is that? Jonathan Westmoreland Hayes, Royce answered. Railroad baron, oil investor, man with enough money to buy senators and governors. The kind of enemy even 500 loyal men can't fight directly. You know him, Nora said, studying Royce's face. It wasn't a question. Royce's jaw tightened. I've never met him, but I know what he's capable of. Gideon, who'd been listening nearby, stepped closer. Tell her, Royce. She deserves to know what we're really facing. Royce was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, quieter, as though the words themselves carried weight. 3 years ago, Hayes wanted to build a railroad through Comanche hunting grounds in West Texas. The tribe refused to sell. They had a treaty, legal, binding, signed by the governor himself. His hand unconsciously moved to the scar along his jaw. A week later, a Comanche hunting party allegedly attacked a settler family, killed them all, including children. But they didn't, Nora guessed, seeing the truth in his eyes. No, it was staged, hired killers dressed as Comanche warriors. I was riding with a Texas Ranger at the time, a man named Ellis Finch. He found tracks, evidence that told a different story. Royce's voice hardened. But before he could present his findings, Ellis was found dead in a brothel, shot by a prostitute who claimed he attacked her. She disappeared the next day. Hayes, Gideon spat the name. Royce nodded. The territorial government declared the treaty void due to Comanche aggression, sent the army to relocate the tribe. Those who resisted were killed. Within a month, Hayes had his railroad. And you've been waiting for a chance to expose him ever since, Nora said, understanding dawning. This isn't just about your land, Nora. Royce's eyes met hers, burning with a cold fire that had nothing to do with the man who'd once loved her quietly by firelight. Hayes represents something that's been happening across the frontier for decades. Powerful men writing history in blood, then covering their tracks with money and influence. How do you fight someone like that? She asked. You don't beat Hayes with guns alone, Royce said, swinging into his saddle. You beat him by surviving, by telling a story he can't bury, by making sure the next time he tries this, people remember what happened here. Gideon was already organizing men, shouting orders for immediate departure. How many defenders left at the canyon? He asked the exhausted rider. Gideon was already organizing men, shouting orders for immediate departure. How many defenders left at the canyon? He asked the exhausted rider. 20 of ours, maybe 15 Apache warriors. But they're running low on ammunition, and the mercenaries have dynamite. They're threatening to collapse the canyon entrance, trapping everyone inside. Royce turned to Nora, his expression grave. We need to move fast. If we ride now, push the horses to their limit, we might reach the canyon by tomorrow morning. Nora nodded, already moving toward her horse. But as she mounted, a terrible realization struck her. The military, she said. If Hayes has the influence you say, he could have them redirected. Used to finish what his mercenaries started. Royce's face was grim as he swung into his saddle. That's exactly what I'm afraid of. Which is why we need to end this before they arrive. He looked toward where Thornton sat among the prisoners, still maintaining his air of imperious disdain despite his circumstances. Gideon, Royce called, change of plans. You'll still take the prisoners to Fort Benton, but I need you to deliver a message to Captain Hollister personally. Tell him Hayes is involved and has hired mercenaries to attack the Apache settlement. Tell him we need military support at the canyon immediately, but under his command, no one else's. Gideon nodded sharply. And if he refuses? Remind him of Wounded Knee. Remind him of his promise. Royce's eyes hardened. And tell him that if he allows another massacre to happen when he could prevent it, I'll make sure the whole country knows his name and what he permitted. The threat hung in the air, all the more powerful for the quiet way it was delivered. Then Royce turned to the rest of his men, raising his voice to carry across the camp. Hayes thinks money can buy him anything, land, lives, even justice itself. He thinks his position protects him from consequences, that men like us are just inconveniences to be swept aside. His voice strengthened, carrying the weight of command that had made 500 men follow him across the frontier. I say we show him exactly how inconvenient we can be. A roar of approval went up from the men. Within minutes, the camp had divided. Gideon and 30 riders prepared to escort the prisoners east to Fort Benton, while Royce, Nora, and over 100 men turned their mounts southwest toward the canyon and the people trapped within. As they rode out, Nora found herself alongside Royce at the head of the column. The rhythm of hooves beating against hard-packed earth created a backdrop to her racing thoughts. "You're worried," she observed, watching his profile as he scanned the horizon. "Hayes won't fight fair," he replied. "Men like him never do. And he has resources we can't match." "Then why do you look so certain?" Royce glanced at her, something fierce and resolute burning in his eyes. "Because some things are worth fighting for, even when you can't win." His eyes held a quiet determination she hadn't seen 5 years ago. Not the desperate need to prove himself, but something steadier, more certain. She watched as he gestured to a young Apache warrior riding nearby, asking him in halting but respectful words about the terrain ahead. The Royce who commanded armies now sought counsel from those he once might have tried to impress. The transformation spoke louder than any declaration of change philosophy. When he turned back to her, Nora simply nodded. No words were needed. They were riding toward an uncertain confrontation, but for the first time in 5 years, she felt absolute clarity about the man beside her. The land stretched before them, endless and unforgiving. Behind them, 100 men followed without question, and somewhere ahead waited an enemy who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. But for the first time in 5 years, Nora felt not fear, but certainty. Whatever waited at the canyon, they would face it together, the quiet cowboy and the Apache woman. As equals, as partners, as they were always meant to be. They rode through the day and deep into the night, stopping only when the horses needed rest. The moon cast silver light across the landscape, transforming the familiar territory into something otherworldly and strange. Nora knew these lands intimately, had hunted them, traversed them, loved them since childhood. Yet tonight they seemed filled with shadows and whispered threats. Royce pushed them relentlessly, his face set in grim determination. The wound in his arm must have been causing him considerable pain, but he showed no sign of weakness. His men followed without complaint, understanding the urgency of their mission. During a brief stop to water the horses, Nora found him standing apart from the others, studying a rough map by moonlight. His profile was sharp against the darkness, the lines of his face etched deeper by exhaustion and worry. "You should rest," she said, approaching quietly. He glanced up. "I'll rest when your people are safe. You won't be able to help them if you collapse from exhaustion." She moved closer, looking down at the map. "The canyon system is extensive. If the mercenaries only hold the main entrance, there are other ways in." Royce's eyes sharpened with interest. "Show me." Nora traced a finger along the paper. "Here, a narrow ravine that connects to the main canyon about a half-mile in. It's difficult to navigate, especially with horses, but passable. My father showed it to me as a child. Few outside the tribe know of it. Could we move a substantial force through it without being detected? 20 men, perhaps. No more. And only if they are willing to travel on foot for the final approach." Royce studied the map, calculation evident in his eyes. "If we could position sharpshooters on the ridges overlooking the main entrance, while a smaller force enters through this ravine, we could catch Hayes's mercenaries between two forces," Nora finished, "just as we did with Thornton's men." A ghost of a smile touched Royce's lips. "You've developed quite a talent for tactical thinking." "I've had a good teacher these past few days." She met his gaze steadily. "Watching you has taught me more than you realize." Something warm flickered in his eyes before he returned his attention to the map. They spent the next hour developing a plan, drawing on Nora's intimate knowledge of the terrain and Royce's tactical experience. By first light, they were moving again, pushing their tired mounts toward the distant smudge of the canyon lands visible on the horizon. As the sun climbed higher, details became clearer. The rugged cliffs rising from the desert floor, the narrow entrance to the canyon system where Nora's people had sought refuge, and something else, wisps of smoke rising from multiple points near the canyon entrance. Campfires, Hayes's mercenaries had established a perimeter. Royce signaled a halt while they were still beyond visual range. The force split as planned. 60 men would circle wide to approach the canyon from above, positioning themselves on the ridges for cover fire. Royce, Nora, and 20 selected fighters would make the difficult approach through the hidden ravine Nora had identified. The remaining men would stay in reserve, ready to charge the main entrance when the signal came. As they prepared to separate, Royce addressed his lieutenants one final time. Remember, we're not just fighting for land or pride today. We're fighting against the kind of men who believe money gives them the right to decide who lives and who does. Men who see people as obstacles to be removed. His voice hardened. Show them exactly what kind of obstacle we can be. The men nodded grimly. There was no need for rousing speeches or dramatic declarations. Every man present understood what was at stake. Nora led her small group toward the hidden ravine, moving cautiously through the broken terrain. The entrance was just as she remembered, a narrow crack in the seemingly solid rock face, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. They dismounted, leaving the horses secured in a sheltered draw, and proceeded on foot. The ravine was treacherous, a twisting path between towering rock walls that in places narrowed to barely the width of a man's shoulders. They moved in single file, silent except for the occasional dislodged stones skittering down the path. Royce followed immediately behind Nora, his breathing steady despite the exertion in his injured arm. After nearly an hour of difficult progress, Nora paused. The ravine widened slightly, and through a gap in the rocks ahead, she could see into the main canyon. Her people's temporary settlement was visible in the distance, makeshift shelters clustered against the far wall, surrounded by armed men in defensive positions. Between them and the settlement were Hayes's mercenaries, at least 40 men that she could count, well-armed and positioned strategically throughout the canyon floor. They had established a blockade at the main entrance and guard posts at regular intervals. Most alarming was what she saw near the canyon entrance, stacked on crates that could only contain the dynamite they'd been warned about. Enough explosive power to collapse the entrance, trapping everyone inside. She signaled for the others to stay back while she and Royce crawled forward to a better vantage point. Lying side by side on a rocky outcrop, they studied the situation below. There, Royce whispered, pointing to a tall man in a long black coat who seemed to be directing operations. That'll be Hayes's man in charge, probably ex-military from his bearing. Nora scanned the canyon floor, counting forces, noting positions. They've got my people contained, but they haven't attacked directly. Why wait? They're expecting reinforcements, Royce said grimly. Probably military, convinced to intervene by Hayes's influence. They just need to keep everyone trapped until official forces arrive to handle the hostile situation. And then they'll have their massacre with government sanction. The bitterness in her voice matched the cold fury in her heart. Royce's hand found hers in the dust, a brief, grounding touch. Not if we move first. And they retreated to where the others waited and quickly outlined what they'd seen. The plan was straightforward, but dangerous. Their small force would move into position near the settlement, providing immediate protection to Nora's people. When the signal came, 3 rapid rifle shots from the ridge, the men on the heights would begin picking off mercenaries while the reserve force charged the main entrance. Timing would be everything. If they moved too soon before all forces were in position, they'd be slaughtered in the open. If they waited too long, the mercenaries might grow suspicious and detonate the dynamite out of spite. As they prepared to move, Nora stopped Royce with a hand on his arm. If this goes wrong, it won't, he said firmly. But if it does, her eyes held his, unflinching. I need you to know that I was wrong 5 years ago. Wrong about what strength is. Wrong about what matters. Her voice softened. Wrong about you. For a moment, the weight of command slipped from his features, revealing the man beneath, the one who had loved her quietly and completely before ambition and pride tore them apart. When this is over, he said, voice low and intimate, we'll have time for everything that needs saying, I promise you that. It wasn't a declaration of forgiveness or an admission of lasting love. It was something more precious, a promise of future, of possibility. A bridge across 5 years of silence. Nora nodded once, then turned to lead them into the canyon. They moved in shadows and whispers, using the irregular terrain for cover. The mercenaries were focused primarily on the main entrance in the Apache settlement, leaving the middle ground less heavily guarded. Still, progress was agonizingly slow, each yard gained through careful movement and tense pauses. When they were approximately halfway to the settlement, a shout went up from one of the guard posts. They'd been spotted. Gunfire erupted immediately, bullets ricocheting off rocks as they dove for cover. Royce bellowed orders, directing his men to defensive positions while returning fire. The careful plan collapsed into chaos as mercenaries converged on their position. But the premature engagement had one advantage. It distracted attention from the ridges above, where Royce's sharpshooters were moving into position, and from the main entrance, where the reserve force was preparing to charge. Nora found herself behind a boulder with Royce, both firing carefully placed shots to keep the mercenaries at bay. Despite the years since she had last held a rifle in combat, her aim was true. Beside her, Royce moved with the efficient precision of a man who had fought too many battles to count, each shot finding its mark. "We need to signal the others," he said between rounds. "We're pinned down here." Nora glanced up at the ridge, barely visible through swirls of gun smoke. "Give me your rifle." He looked at her questioningly. "Mine doesn't have the range. I need yours." She held out her hand, determination in her eyes. "3 shots, remember? I'm the better shot at distance, and you know it." After a moment's hesitation, he handed over his Winchester, superior in both range and accuracy to her own weapon. Nora took a deep breath, visualizing the shot before she moved. Then, in one fluid motion, she rose from cover, aimed at the sky above the ridge, and fired 3 rapid shots. Bullets whined past her as she dropped back behind the boulder, but the signal was sent. Almost immediately, gunfire erupted from the ridges above. Royce's sharpshooters opened fire on the mercenaries below. Caught in a deadly crossfire, Hayes's men scrambled for cover, momentarily forgetting the small force they had pinned down. It was enough. Royce signaled his men to advance, using the confusion to push forward toward the Apache settlement. Nora moved at his side, and the two of them perfectly synchronized as they alternated covering fire and forward movement. From the main entrance came the thunder of hooves and the battle cry of the reserve force charging into the canyon. The mercenaries, suddenly beset from 3 directions, began to falter, their coordinated defense breaking down into individual survival. The man in the black coat, Hayes's commander, shouted orders, trying to rally his forces. When that failed, he turned and ran toward the dynamite stacked near the entrance. Royce saw it at the same moment Nora did. "He's going to blow the entrance!" he shouted. "Stop him!" They both fired, but the distance was too great, the target moving too quickly. The commander reached the stacked crates, and Nora's heart froze as she saw him strike a match. Then a single shot rang out from somewhere high on the canyon wall. The commander staggered, the match falling from suddenly lifeless fingers. He crumpled beside the dynamite, blood blossoming across his chest. On the ridge above, a lone figure stood with a rifle, one of the Apache warriors who had been trapped inside, who had managed to scale the seemingly unclimbable canyon wall to reach a sniper's position. The tide of battle turned decisively. With their commander dead and enemies on all sides, the mercenaries began to surrender. Some fought to the end, but within a half hour the canyon was secured. Hayes's force was defeated, captured, or dead. Nora ran toward the settlement, Royce at her side. Her people emerged from their shelters, children clinging to parents, elders moving with cautious hope. There were embraces, tears, the particular joy of survival after expecting death. The silver-haired elder emerged from the crowd, her weathered face breaking into a rare smile as she saw Nora. "You brought an army," she said, looking past her to where Royce's men were securing prisoners. "Just as the spirits said you would." "Not my army," Nora replied, glancing at Royce. "His." The elder studied Royce with knowing eyes. "Not anymore," she said quietly. "Now he fights for something greater than pride or power. Now he fights for love." She looked between them. "Both of you do." Before either could respond, a commotion at the canyon entrance drew their attention. Riders were approaching, not mercenaries, but uniformed soldiers. At their head rode a stern-faced officer with captain's insignia. Royce stepped forward, positioning himself between the approaching soldiers and the Apache settlement. His men formed a line behind him, rifles not raised but ready. It was a clear message. "To reach these people, you all have to come through us." The captain reined in his mount, studying the scene before him. Captured mercenaries, armed civilians, in a clearly defensive posture. "Captain Hollister," Royce greeted him, voice neutral. "You made good time." "Gideon was persuasive," the captain replied, his gaze moving from the defeated mercenaries to the Apache settlement behind. I see you handled the situation before we arrived. These men, Royce gestured to the captured mercenaries, were hired by Jonathan Westmoreland Hayes to eliminate the Apache settlement and clear the way for his railroad and oil operations. They had plans to use dynamite to collapse the canyon entrance, trapping women and children inside. Hollister's expression darkened. You have proof of this allegation? The same proof I sent to you regarding Thornton. Financial records, correspondence, witness testimony. Royce's voice hardened. Hayes tried to orchestrate a massacre for profit. I expect the United States Army to ensure justice is served, not to become complicit in his crimes. For a tense moment, it was unclear how the captain would respond. Then he dismounted, handing his reins to a subordinate, and walked forward alone. 5 years ago, he said quietly, for Royce's ears alone, I followed orders that led to the deaths of women and children at wounded. I've carried that weight every day since. His eyes moved to the Apache families gathering cautiously behind Royce. I won't add to that burden. Not for Hayes, not for anyone. He turned to his men. Secure the prisoners, treat the wounded, all of them, and send riders to Fort Benton with a full report on what we found here. His voice carried clear authority. We are here to uphold the law and protect the innocent. Nothing more, nothing less. Relief washed through Nora as she watched the soldiers dismount and begin carrying out their captain's orders. There would be no massacre today. No burial of a people for the profit of distant men in Eastern offices. As the immediate crisis subsided, she found Royce standing apart from the others, looking out over the canyon that had nearly become a tomb. The lines of command had eased from his face, replaced by something that looked like weariness mingled with wonder. It's over, she said, joining him. As Nora approached, she noticed the way he favored his left leg, a fresh wound from the battle that would likely leave him with a permanent limp. His face, already weathered by years of hardship, now bore another scar across his temple where a bullet had grazed him during the final assault. The physical toll was evident, but she could see a deeper cost in his eyes. Across the canyon floor, men were laying out the bodies of the fallen. 17 of Royce's men had died today, men who had followed him loyally for years. Among them was Eli, the former buffalo hunter who had been one of the first to join Royce's company. Nearby, 4 Apache warriors were being prepared for traditional burial rites, their lives given to protect the future of their people. The silver-haired elder moved among the dead, blessing each one regardless of origin. We won, Royce said quietly, but victory always demands payment in blood. He gestured toward the canyon entrance where the dynamite had been secured, but not before a partial detonation had collapsed one section of the wall. That path can never be restored. The canyon's main entrance is forever changed, just as we are. Nora understood the deeper meaning in his words. The canyon, like their lives, would bear the scars of this day forever. Her people would sorry, but they would never again live with the innocent certainty that their ancestral lands were truly their own. The shadow of outside threat would always linger at the edges of their consciousness. Some of my men won't ride again, Royce continued, nodding toward where the wounded were being tended. Daniel's lost an arm. Michael's will never see from his right eye. Thomas took a bullet in the spine. His voice remained steady, but she could hear the weight of responsibility in each word. They followed me into this, knowing the cost might be high. They chose their path, Nora said gently. As did I, as did you. Choices have consequences, he replied, even the right ones. He turned to her fully then, and she could see that something fundamental had shifted within him. The man who had built an empire on strength and command now understood its true price in a way he hadn't before. I spent 5 years becoming someone powerful enough to change the world. I never considered how much the world would change me in return. This battle was won, he said, but Hayes's kind won't stop, not really. The fight for this land, for all lands like it, will continue long after we're gone. Then we build something worth fighting for, Nora answered. Something that will outlast us both. Yes, Royce said, his gaze moving from the fallen to the survivors gathering in the center of the canyon. But we do so knowing exactly what it costs. This battle was won, and he said, but Hayes's kind won't stop, not really. The fight for this land, for all lands like it, will continue long after we're gone. Then we build something worth fighting for, Nora answered. Something that will outlast us both. Yes, Royce said, his gaze moving from the fallen to the survivors gathering in the center of the canyon. But we do so knowing exactly what it is. It's over, she said, turning him. This battle, perhaps. He glanced at her. Hayes won't stop because he lost a few hired guns. Men like him never stop until they get what they want, or until they face something they can't buy or intimidate. Nora looked back at the scene before them. Apache families reuniting with Royce's men, soldiers helping the wounded, the beginning of understanding between groups that had long viewed each other with suspicion. Perhaps this is just the first victory in a longer war. Royce considered this, then nodded slowly. A war worth fighting. Together, she added, her hand finding his. He looked down at their joined hands, then back to her face. The setting sun painted the canyon in gold and shadow, casting his features in warm light that softened the hard edges experience had carved into him. The setting sun painted the canyon in gold and shadow as they stood together, watching the impossible peace unfold before them. Apache families, Royce's men, and soldiers working side by side. Royce took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. The gesture spoke volumes, not of the commander who'd returned with an army, but of the quiet cowboy who'd once been content just to sit by her fire. When he finally spoke, he didn't look backward. Tomorrow, he said simply, his voice carrying a certainty that needed no grand declarations. We build something new. Nora squeezed his hand in response. The walls between them had crumbled not through words of regret, but through the choices they'd made when it mattered most. The space between them disappeared as Royce drew her close, his arms encircling her with a gentleness that belied his strength. She felt the steady beat of his heart against her cheek, the warmth of him chasing away the chill of too many lonely years. Where do we go from here? He murmured into her hair. Nora pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. Forward, she said simply. Together. The kiss that followed was both an ending and a beginning, the conclusion of 5 years of separation and the first step toward a future neither had dared to imagine possible. When they finally parted, both breathing unevenly, the world around them seemed to have receded, leaving only the two of them in a moment suspended between past regret and future promise. Reality intruded in the form of Gideon approaching with news from Captain Hollister. There were decisions to be made, arrangements to coordinate. The practical aftermath of victory demanded attention. As Royce turned to address these matters, his hand remained linked with Nora's. A small but profound declaration that whatever came next, they would face it not as leader and follower, not as protector and protected, but as equals bound by something stronger than duty or tradition. The days that followed brought challenges of their own. Hayes's influence reached far, and the battle for the canyon lands shifted from rifles and dynamite to telegrams and legal documents. But with Captain Hollister's testimony, Thornton's captured records, and the evidence of attempted massacre, even Hayes's money couldn't bury the truth completely. A month after the battle, official word arrived from Washington. The Apache claim to the Canyon territories was recognized and protected by federal treaty. Hayes's railroad would be required to divert its path. The oil beneath their lands could not be extracted without tribal permission and fair compensation. It wasn't a perfect victory. Such things rarely existed in a world where money still spoke louder than justice. But it was enough to ensure survival, enough to build a future upon. Royce's 500 gradually dispersed. Some remained, finding places in the growing settlement that emerged as the Apache people returned to their traditional lands. Others rode on to new horizons, carrying with them the stories of battles fought and won, of a leader who had taught them that strength came in many forms. Royce himself stayed, setting aside the mantle of command for something both simpler and more profound. He built a home on the edge of the settlement, a place where the traditions of two worlds could meet and blend, where a former drifter who had commanded armies could find peace in the quiet moments between dusk and dawn, holding the woman he had loved for longer than either cared to count. The silver-haired elder blessed their union in the Apache way, binding their lives together under stars that had witnessed both their separation and reunion. There were no councils to object, no traditions to stand in the way of what both hearts knew to be true. And as the seasons turned, the legend grew. Not just of the quiet cowboy who had returned with 500 men, but of the Apache woman who had been wise enough to recognize true strength when it stood before her the second time, who had fought alongside him rather than behind him, who had helped him remember that the most enduring power lay not in command or control, but in the courage to love completely, even after loss. Together, they built something neither could have created alone, a community where differences were strength, where the wisdom of the past met the possibilities of the future. A place where children grew up knowing that true belonging came not from blood or birthright, but from the choices that defined a life. A promised land built not on paper deeds or government treaties, but on the unshakable foundation of two hearts that had found their way home. In the years that followed, the canyon settlement grew into something neither Apache tradition nor Western ambition could have predicted alone. They called it Harmony Creek, a name that acknowledged both the natural beauty of the land and the unlikely peace that had taken root there. At its center stood a circular meeting hall, built in the Apache style but large enough to accommodate the diverse community that had formed. Former cavalrymen who had grown weary of war sat alongside Apache elders during council meetings. Children of mixed heritage ran through fields where battles once raged, and on the walls of the meeting hall hung both traditional tribal symbols and maps of the modernizing West. A visual reminder that survival required both honoring the past and embracing the future. Royce's military precision found new purpose in organizing irrigation systems that made the arid land bloom with crops. Under his guidance, they built defenses not just against human threats, but against the harsh realities of desert life: water storage for droughts, reinforced shelters for storms. The tactical mind that had once commanded 500 men now turned to creating sustainable systems that would outlast any single leader. Nora, meanwhile, became the bridge between worlds. Her knowledge of Apache traditions blended with pragmatic adaptation to changing times. She established a school where children learned both tribal wisdom and the skills needed to navigate the encroaching modern world. "Knowledge is the one weapon that can never be taken from you," she would tell her students. Not everyone approved of their vision. Some traditionalists from both cultures kept their distance, viewing the settlement as a betrayal of purity. Railroad barons and oilmen continued their push westward, forced to circumvent the protected canyon lands, but never ceasing their expansion. Hayes himself died 3 years later in a banking scandal, but others of his ilk arose to take his place. Yet the settlement endured. When government officials came to inspect their progress, expecting to find an excuse for intervention, they discovered instead a thriving community with its own economic system, selling handcrafted goods, carefully managed timber, and guide services to travelers. Self-sufficient enough to maintain independence, organized enough to demand respect. Captain Hollister visited occasionally, bringing news from the changing nation beyond their borders. During one such visit, he stood with Royce on a ridge overlooking the settlement, now grown to nearly 300 souls. "You've built something remarkable here," the captain observed, "something that shouldn't exist according to every expert back east." Royce nodded, watching children play near the creek that gave the settlement its name. Among them was his own daughter, a small, fierce girl with her mother's determination and her father's quiet intensity. "The experts measure strength by how much you can take," he replied. "We measure it by how much you can build." He turned to Hollister with the hint of a smile. "And by how much you're willing to defend." The legacy of Harmony Creek extended beyond its borders. Other communities, learning of their success, began to forge their own paths between tradition and progress. A new kind of frontier emerged, not one of conquest and displacement, but of adaptation and respect. A template for what might be possible when people valued land and relationships over profit and power. It wasn't paradise. Challenges arose with each passing season. But it was theirs, a hard-won home where the quiet cowboy and the Apache woman had finally found the strength to build something that mattered more than pride, more than the past, more than all the forces that had tried to keep them apart. A true promised land.